the effective date of the ordinance. Tree service providers would then have 90 days to register with SDCI following the setup period. After this 90 days, all tree service providers would need to be registered in order to apply for permits or provide tree-related reports to SDCI. It would define commercial tree work as to conduct major pruning, removal of trees larger than 6 inches diameter at breast height, and the assessment of tree health or hazard risk for financial compensation. It excludes routine pruning activities that do not meet the threshold of major pruning. It would define tree service provider as an entity engaged in commercial tree work and require that registered tree service providers comply with various best practices related to the specific type of work for which they are engaged, such as maintaining adequate supervision over their workers as they conduct the work, assessing what the appropriate level of tree work is needed to meet clients' objectives. It authorize SDCI to create rules as needed to support administration of the registry, amend other sections of Title 23 to align with the legislation's intent. Only registered tree service providers conduct commercial tree work. This table was a side-by-side comparison of what is being proposed in the legislation before you and SDOT's existing registry system. Since we talked about this at length on last month, I will just kind of remind you of the key differences. Here we have the commercial liability insurance coverage is required, but SDCI has discretion to determine what is the appropriate amount. SDOT allows tree service providers to either have a currently credentialed International Society of Arboriculture certified arborist on staff or retainer, whereas the Council Bill 120207 would require that that person be on staff. There is also a shorter public notice requirement, and a number of folks in the public comment noted this. I would just say, for you all, that the difference acknowledges that the SDCI public notice is more about just letting people know that commercial tree work is authorized, but is not necessarily an appealable decision, right? So that is just something that SDCI acknowledges, and whereas SDOT's public notice is actually intended to inform and allow people to appeal the decision, and thus there's kind of that greater span of time because these are publicly owned trees, right? So there's a kind of a difference of who owns the tree and who's making that decision. So also the penalty would be different if the bill as introduced. SDOT would remove, so SDOT's current practice is to remove a tree service provider from the registry for a year after it's been issued 2 notices of violation. The proposed registry would prohibit SDCI from accepting tree-related reports from a tree service provider who has been issued a single notice of violation related to the illegal removal of an exceptional tree. So I kind of ran through that, but does anyone have any questions about anything on this slide before I move on?
Just noting, Yolanda, a lot of these issues have been changed in the substitute. So this was the starting point for the bill that we had at last committee, and council members, maybe it would be helpful if I moved the legislation so that we could take up the substitute that makes significant changes to this. Do I see consensus there, or do other folks have questions at this time? Councilmember, Vice Chair Morales, please take it away.
Sorry, I just have a quick question about what it means to resolve a violation in the penalty section. Is that paying a fine?
Yeah, that's typically paying a fine, or if SDCI withdrew the violation, right? So that those are 2 kind of pathways.
And I just interjecting, I think some of that language is cleaned up in the substitute. So I'm going to move the bill so that we can discuss the substitute at this time. Unless Councilmember Nelson, do you have questions? I see you. No. So before we take up amendments, I will place the legislation before us. So I move to recommend passage of Council Bill 120207. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. It has been moved and seconded. The first of 3 amendments today is a substitute amendment that Councilmember Peterson and I co-sponsored together. This substitute reflects a suite of changes we agreed to, and that will make this legislation more effective. It includes technical changes, extends the implementation time to 5 months in line with SDCI's implementation memo, and sets a date certain, November 10th, for tree service providers to register by. It allows for tree service providers to have an arborist either on staff or on retainer rather than only on staff, and aligns penalties with SDOT's registry so that a tree service provider would be removed from the registry for 1 year after 2 violations. And lastly, it adjusts the requirements for a tree risk assessment qualification or track, requiring that an applicant for a hazardous tree removal permit must be track qualified, and requiring that for hazardous exceptional trees, a different tree service provider must file the permit rather than as compared to the provider who plans to do the removal. Yolanda, Councilmember Peterson, did I miss anything? And Yolanda, if you have a different slide that reflects the substitute, I think that's important to have visually on the screen at this time.
Yeah, well, I that's fine. There was just one more slide before I got to that. It was that I wanted to talk about the implementation analysis as kind of like just one more piece of new information before we moved into that. But would you prefer that I go to that slide that shows kind of the track changes version, and then
yes, I think just there was some confusion just a minute ago. So I think
well, here it is, and then we can move back to the SDCI implementation analysis, I think, for folks' reference. Yes, Council Chair, you did. I think you got all the critical points on what is included. Some of those things are not reflected in this table, in particular the hazardous tree permit requirements that you note. But I am noting in this slide where now there is kind of more consistency between SDOT's registry and what would be in the council bill before you, amended council bill before you. So again, noting that ISA certified arborist on staff or retainer, so now that one will match. Public notice would be, there's another amendment, amendment 4 that would create business days. Then the substitute would also bring the penalty structure into alignment with SDOT's.
Very helpful. Councilmember Peterson, any thoughts on this?
I agree. This slide's very helpful in clearing up some of the earlier questions that so the substitute basically addresses. Thank you.
Wonderful. Vice Chair Morales, Councilmember Nelson, Mosqueda, any questions from you? I'm seeing none. Yolanda, would you like to finish your presentation? Sorry
no
for
problem.
interrupting.
No, keeping it fluid. It's all good. So I just wanted to highlight for the committee that we did receive some additional information between the committee meeting, the last committee meeting on this subject, and today. And that implementation memo from SDCI is attached to the agenda. And so SDCI anticipates that it will take about 5 to 7 months to build the registry and associated automated features that would help with registration and creating public notices. And also that SDCI noted that this new system needs to integrate with the overall Acela permitting system so that reviewers are able to easily confirm that tree service providers are registered as required. The department estimates that the total cost of implementing this proposal this year will be between about $300,000 and $470,000, with roughly half of this amount supported by the general fund, and the remainder can be permit fee supported. These costs include outreach, development of the technology to support the registry, and temporary staff to support these efforts. The department anticipates requesting the additional general fund support in the forthcoming mid-year supplemental budget. SDCI will then consider what, if any, ongoing staffing and funding needs might be necessary next year, and these would be included in the 2023 proposed budget. Does anyone have any questions about any of that information?
Colleagues? Seeing none, take it away.
Okay. So I think we talked about the substitute, so just wanted to give a chance to ask any questions. The chair very well captured all the many different kind of big pieces there. I want to kind of highlight the hazardous tree permit requirement one. That one's kind of I would say the biggest change. And this is, the city already requires that anybody removing a tree have the ISA track or tree risk assessment qualification credential. So that is already a requirement. But the change here is more around codifying some of the requirements that are in what SDCI has a hazard tree tip that they updated a couple of years ago. That includes a report about the health of the tree, and but the difference here is that we would have a tree if the tree that would be removed that is also being deemed hazardous would meet the city's definition of exceptional. This would require that there be two different registered tree service providers involved, right? So there would be one who would independently assess the tree and submit the required application materials, and then the other tree service provider would perform the major pruning or removal. So in no case can there be just one tree service provider who applies for the permit and performs the removal. So that is a new requirement that the city does not have, but otherwise the required report, the ISA track credential, those are existing requirements.
Thank you, Yolanda. Very helpful. Colleagues, do you have further questions about the substitute? I'm not seeing any. So I think at this time, and to keep us moving along, before we vote on this, just last check, Councilmember Peterson, nothing more to add? Good to go? Sounds great. I would move to amend Council Bill 120207 as shown in Substitute Amendment 1. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. It has been moved and seconded to amend Council Bill 120207 as shown in Substitute Amendment 1. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Member Peterson?
Aye.
Councilmember Nelson?
Aye.
Councilmember Mosqueda?
Aye.
Vice Chair Morales?
Yes.
Chair Strauss?
Yes.
5 in favor, none opposed.
Wonderful. The motion carries, and Substitute Amendment 1 carries. There is no Amendment 2, and so we will move to Councilmember Peterson's Amendment 3. Councilmember Peterson, would you like to describe your amendment?
Actually, if central staff would describe it, that would be ideal. It's just a paragraph.
Sure.
Yolanda, take it away.
All right. Amendment 3 would add an additional report requirement to the short subdivision or boundary line adjustment process. This would require that either a registered tree service provider or a state registered landscape architect provide a report describing how the design of a proposed subdivision supports the city's policy of maximizing retention of its existing trees. Currently, the city only requires that a registered surveyor draw plat maps and does not require an explanation of how the plats were drawn to maximize retention of its existing trees. We'll just note that the subdivision process does not involve permitting development directly, but does usually take proposed development into account, such as building footprints and vehicular access.
Thank you, Yolanda. Councilmember Peterson?
Thank you, Chair Strauss. Thank you, Yolanda, for that description. Colleagues, it's just one paragraph. You see that it's as published on the agenda today. It's the same language that was actually in the February 3rd Central Staff Memo on the February 9th agenda. And it says either a registered tree service provider or Washington State licensed landscape architect will prepare a report. It could be less than a page. Is submitted to the director of SDCI. And that's only if there's going to be a subdivision or a boundary line adjustment. And they would simply describe how they're trying to maximize retention of trees. It's not required that the trees be retained. It's really just if we're trying to get at this goal of yes, we can maximize units, we can maximize trees. It's really about just being more creative and proactive early in the process, configuring the footprint of the proposed building in a way that tries to retain the trees. So it's having trees top of mind earlier in the process. I know that creative architects and landscape architects can get this done to maximize both units and trees. And this is just requiring that they put down on paper how they're trying to do that. So I would ask for your support of this amendment. I'm happy to answer questions or try to move it first.
Thank you, Councilmember Peterson. I have some comments, but I will wait to share them. Vice Chair Morales, please take it away.
Well, I do have some questions about this amendment, but I don't know if you want to move the amendment first and then have the discussion. I'm happy to do it either way.
Sure, maybe I'll share my thoughts, and Councilmember Peterson, I'll let you move it, and then we can take up some discussion. And so I really appreciate, Councilmember Peterson, the intent behind what you're bringing forward in this amendment today. And I unfortunately will not be able to support the amendment today. While I appreciate your intent to ensure we are maximizing protection of trees during subdivision process, I do believe that this change will impose added costs on housing without a new public benefit, as we already have a requirement as part of the subdivision process that applicants must maximize the retention of existing trees. And when SDCI reviews applications for subdivisions, one of their responsibilities is to ensure that existing trees are being retained to the maximum extent possible. We've had so many conversations in this committee about the permitting process backlog and delays associated with our permitting process. I can't, I have to remain committed to those goals of moving this work forward. And I am wary of adding another layer on today. Because we do know that every time the city imposes a new requirement for permits, it lengthens the permit review times and adds another cost for producing much needed housing in the city. And I would say that if this was not already on the books, I would feel very differently. And I just want to center my appreciation for you, Councilmember Peterson, and your team for bringing this forward. I'll let you move the amendment if you so desire.
Thank you, Chair Strauss. Yes, colleagues, I move Amendment 3 to Council Bill 120207 as presented on today's agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and seconded to amend Council Bill 120207 as shown in Amendment 3. Before I move for a vote, we wanted further discussion. Is that correct? Yes. Vice Chair Morales, please take it away. Oh, still on mute.
Sorry about that. I think, so I did have a brief conversation with Councilmember Peterson about this, and I'm not sure if he or Yolanda would want to answer these questions, but I do have kind of some sequencing questions about what would happen. If the intent here is to maximize retention of trees, then my questions are, when is the report due? How long do these kinds of reports take? Would something like this delay the project? Is the requirement to submit the report to delay or, to prevent the tree from getting cut down? Or is it just to provide information? So it doesn't sound to me like it's required to get approval to cut the tree down. And so that makes me just wonder what the point is. So maybe Yolanda, you can kind of walk me through like the sequence of what information we would gather from this and what purpose it would serve.
Sure. So I think this, as I had mentioned before, the subdivision process does not it's not permitting actual development, right? So it wouldn't permit removal of trees. It is just kind of, that process is for a developer to show how the lots will be drawn, right? So it's the plat map. And then as a part of the approval of that plat map, this report would be required, right? So prior to SDCI saying, okay, good, your subdivision looks good, we still would, this would be a new report added to that process. Now, in terms of what the report is exactly, that is up to SDCI. former life as a landscape architect, I, could imagine writing, a brief paragraph saying that this is drawn in such a way that, this north lot was kind of configured so that this specific tree was maybe kind of in the corner versus in the center of the lot, right? So something like that. So it is I think intentionally vague to give SDCI some space to decide what it is that they would think is helpful in terms of decision making and reviewing the plat map that is proposed. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think I appreciate it. I think I'm sort of I still have the similar concerns to Chair Strauss, which is that this feels like an extra layer that doesn't give us a whole lot of information and could potentially delay projects. So I'm just not sure I can support this right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Councilmember Mosqueda.
Thank you very much. And a possible question for either the sponsor or for central staff. It's my understanding that SDCI is currently enforcing retention policies for subdivision and boundary line adjustments. Is that the case?
There is an existing policy that states as part of the approval process that the SDCI director shall consider how the proposal maximizes the retention of existing trees. So that you are correct. That is an existing policy.
Okay. To the good sponsor and for the chair and the committee, I think this is an interesting concept. I am supportive of the intent to make sure that those retention policies are robust. I'm hoping that this actually might be something that we could continue to flesh out a little bit more given the ongoing tree protection ordinances that we will be considering later this year. And I'd be really interested in hearing from the departments directly about to what extent SDCI is seeing maybe a problem with the current approach, whether we can look for ways to strengthen that enforcement in the upcoming tree protection ordinance, and especially how we can strengthen that without adding additional time or processes to the already existing permitting process, which we know just equals additional costs. And if we're thinking about building things like housing, additional time and cost to that. So I do appreciate the intent here. I think that for me as well, the concern for amendment number 3 at this juncture without that additional feedback from the department is the potential for unintended consequences and slowing down the permitting process. And looking forward to hearing more about how we can avoid unintended impacts on cost and timeline, as well as make sure that we are protecting those boundaries.
Thank you, Councilmember Mosqueda. Any further comments on the amendment? Councilmember Peterson, would you like the last word?
Thank you, Chair Strauss. I really appreciate the questions and the comments from all of you and Councilmember Mosqueda's vision of like trying to look at this in a comprehensive manner as we move forward as well. I think one of the concerns from some of the community is that, SGCI is put in a difficult position. They're required to do so many different things with the project. And, there is a whole movement out there to have trees under, Office of Sustainability and Environment or some single department. And I think this was just a small step to say, let's be more mindful and creative earlier in the process so that we can do both, maximize units and trees. That is going to take, that won't happen on its own. And so this was a way of doing it where you have the expertise of the landscape architect or arborist to opine briefly about how they are maximizing. And that could in fact help the SDCI director make a better decision if they are informed by that expertise early on by the landscape architect or the arborist as part of when there is a lot line adjustment, which is all this is proposing to do. So I'm sure if this doesn't pass today, we'll see something like it again later in our process. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Peterson. And it has been moved and seconded to amend Council Bill 120207 as shown in Amendment 3. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Peterson,
Yes.
Councilmember Nelson,
Abstain.
Councilmember Mosqueda,
No.
Vice Chair Morales,
No.
Chair Strauss.
No.
1 in favor, 3 opposed, 1 abstention.
Thank you. The Amendment 3 to Council Bill 120207 fails. The motion fails. I think it has been echoed loud and clear. We all support your intent, Councilmember Peterson, and we all look forward to working with you on this further. Our final amendment today is Amendment 4, which I'm proposing. This amendment would change the requirement that public notice be given for 3 days. The change from just 3 days before tree removal to 3 business days to avoid a scenario in which a notice is posted on a Friday for a Monday removal. It also requires that the notice include additional information such as the copy of the tree service provider's registration and whether a permit is required for removal or not. It also clarifies that the hiring entity, as in the property owner or manager, is responsible for posting the notice. Yolanda, did I miss anything with that?
One minor thing is that the tree service provider would provide said notice to the hiring entity. So that is one small thing, but otherwise you got it all.
Thank you. Thank you. Colleagues, any questions, discussion before we vote on this amendment? Seeing none, it's a straightforward one, and apparently I play central staff on TV all right. So I move to amend Council Bill 120207 as shown in Amendment 4. Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved and seconded to amend Council Bill 120207 as shown in Amendment 4. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Peterson,
Yes.
Councilmember Nelson,
Aye.
Councilmember Mosqueda,
Aye.
Vice Chair Morales,
Yes.
Chair Strauss,
Yes.
Councilmember not opposed.
Thank you. Motion carries. Amendment 4 to Council Bill 120207 passes. We can now move to the passage of the underlying legislation. Before I move that, are there any final comments before we vote? And Councilmember Peterson, I'll give you the last word on all of this. Councilmember Mosqueda, I see you have a hand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I did want to take a quick second just to thank you, Mr. Chair, and also Councilmember Peterson. Councilmember Peterson, thanks for your leadership between the two of you for bringing this bill forward. And I especially want to thank you for the substitute. I didn't really get a chance to comment on the substitute as we voted, but I think the substitute is a great combination of amendments that address some of the equity concerns that we had regarding small BIPOC immigrant-owned businesses to make sure that there was the ability to collaborate and work with certified arborists. I also appreciate the inclusion of an option to have an arborist for retention that will achieve the same ends of having that expertise on hand while not creating a barrier for those smallest businesses. So thanks for your work on the substitute as well. I did want to ask Mr. Chair of central staff here, something that I'm going to start doing as more of a practice in our committees that we participate in is really asking central staff to lift up before final passage fiscal notes so that we have an opportunity to take a look one more time at the fiscal note. Obviously, this is something that I should have probably also called out in the initial briefing of the legislation, but we'll be doing so as just a more routine basis as we look at final passage. So, Yolanda, thanks again, Ms. Ho, for talking about the fiscal note in your presentation. You noted that depending on the extent of rulemaking by the director of SDCI to implement the ordinance, there may be city FTE position commitments needed to implement the registration requirement, depending on the number of complaints received. I'm wondering if we might just have you elaborate on that for just a quick second, given the budget situation that we're all in and in together as a city family. We are looking forward to opportunities to mindfully move forward important legislation like this, as well as couple these discussions on policy with the fiscal impact, since we don't have a traditional system, as Councilmember Strauss, I know, is something you were advocating for last year, to have a policy committee, then a fiscal committee, and then full council. So would love to take a second, if you might, for central staff to help us identify any additional considerations around the fiscal note, and if there's a possible funding source. Again, I'll underscore my support for this legislation. This is not intended to be a roadblock or a pushing pause conversation by any means. I do want to make sure that folks know this is something I'm going to be asking of all legislation, but I thought it was a great opportunity for us to show the importance of this legislation while also lifting up the fiscal impacts and be mindful of that as we look at the constraints facing us in this upcoming budget session.
I would note that STCI is a largely permit fee supported department, and so I think I do not know to what extent that they have their ways of calculating what can be general fund, what can be permit fee supported, and so the hope would be that most of the FTE, depending, there's a body of work that I think the complaints and dealing with that may be general fund supported, but I might be getting that reversed. But there is kind of a body of work in STCI that cannot be permit fee supported, but the vast majority of the work there is permit fee supported. So I think that it will be good for us to understand how much of that ongoing work can be permit fee supported versus on the general fund, right? And so that will be, I think, to be determined as SDCI kind of gets this thing up and running, and starts to see what the asks of it are and all those things. So we don't quite know, and that's why we kind of had to wait. So if you look at the fiscal note of this bill, it is not going to be particularly informative because I was waiting on SDCI's analysis to kind of help inform the council on kind of the fiscal impacts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad to know that there is a possible revenue source, and I think that will be helpful for the broader conversation again that we hope to have later this year. Thank you very much.
I almost said Vice Chair. Councilmember Mosqueda, very well said. As Chair of the Finance Committee, I think that the tension is just completely spot on. One thing that I've noticed in the tree work that we've been doing from a policy level is that when enforcement is conducted for folks that have broken the rules, cutting down trees in environmentally critical areas or without permits, there are fines levied against them, and those fines are returned to the general fund at large, rather than being retained for tree planting, tree maintenance, or even just this work that we're discussing here. So I think that there are more ways that we are able to protect trees and fund these programs, because what's happening right now is those fines are being levied as a deterrent, yet those dollars are not actually helping regrow our city's canopy. Well, with that, Councilmember Peterson, any final words?
I have nothing to add. Thank you, Chair Strauss.
Thank you. I'm just very thankful for you and your team for bringing this forward and for allowing me to co-sponsor. With that, would you like to move the bill, or? I'll do it. I recommend passage of Council Bill 120207 as amended. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. It has been moved and seconded to recommend passage of Council Bill 120207 as amended. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Peterson?
Yes.
Councilmember Nelson?
Aye.
Councilmember Mosqueda?
Aye.
Vice Chair Morales?
Yes.
Chair Strauss?
Yes.
5 in favor, none opposed.
Thank you. The motion carries. Council Bill 120207 as amended passes and will be back before the City Council on Tuesday for a final vote. I want to give a especially huge thank you to Councilmember Peterson, Yolanda, Toby, and Noah for all working together on this incredible work. Thank you. Up next the next item is a resolution ratifying countywide planning policies. Mr. Ahn, will you please read the abbreviated title into the record?
Item 3